Monsters are real, and ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the fourth episode of season 7, and today we are talking about Stephen King.
All right. Well, like Mel said in her introduction, we are coming back to our Masters of Horror that we started with Peter Straub and took a diversion away from to talk about the pilot episode of Mike Flanagan's The Midnight Club. But we're coming back to do another Masters of Horror, this time on someone who I'm a little bit shocked it's taken this long to do something so exclusively on them. I mean, we're in season 7 here, and we're just now doing an episode focused around Stephen King. We've mentioned him, but we haven't done anything fully dedicated or centered around him. And so, yeah, we decided we would do a Masters of Horror on Stephen King. I I feel like he's always been kind of an elephant in the room in regards to the podcast because he is such a preeminent name in horror, and so I wonder if maybe unconsciously, this is not anything we ever discussed, but I do wonder if maybe we kind of avoided doing an episode squarely on him for so long because I mean he's such a well-known author. I mean, you ask any layperson who barely knows anything about the horror genre, and they'll recognize the name Stephen King instantly. Um, he's prolific. He's been writing for years and years and years, and so I mean it's kind of hard to tackle him in some ways, but we will definitely do our best. But since this is also a horror podcast, we may assume you are at least a little bit familiar with Stephen King and his work, even if you're not experts on it. But just as kind of background, he was born in 1947. He has written, or at least published, he may have written more, but he has published 64 novels over the course of his career thus far. 7 of those were under a pen name of Richard Bachman. He's written approximately 200 or so short stories, most of which have been published in various book collections. I could start listing off the awards that he has received throughout his career, but suffice to say they are numerous and plentiful. But they include things like the Bram Stoker Awards, the World Fantasy Awards, the National Book Foundation. He's I'm sorry, the National Book Foundation gave him the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. I mean, he's had lots and lots and lots of awards, and at least in my opinion, pretty justifiably so. For those of you who may not be as familiar, just kind of the basic overview of his writing career. Apparently, he sold his first professional short story in 1967 to Startling Mystery Stories, and but it wasn't really until 1973 when he published Carrie. That was published, it was the fourth book that he had written, but the first one that he published. And I mean, it's pretty much a touchstone of horror. I mean, those of you who have read Carrie know the story, and it's been adapted into several films, most notably, of course, the classic 70s version with Sissy Spacek. It's it really set things off, and in some ways I think pigeonholed him as strictly a horror writer, because he has definitely, over the course of those 64 novels and 200 plus short stories, he has explored a lot of territory. Not all of it horror, some of it related to fantasy, some of it nonfiction even. But, we know Stephen King mostly as a horror writer. And, I'm not going to go read off all 64 of those novels, but just to rattle off a couple of the big ones. I mean, he's Carrie, Cujo, Salem's Lot, The Stand, It. I mean, these are um, huge influences on so many writers, because have just become almost embedded in our culture. I mean, I feel like anyone who has not even read Cujo, may not have even heard of Stephen King, will know that if you call a dog Cujo, they mean a vicious killer dog. So, he has definitely had a very massive impact in culture, not just in horror specifically. I did kind of want to mention briefly something that I had actually mentioned in our Peter Straub episode about the novel that he co-wrote with Stephen King, where I recommended to Mel that she look into Stephen King's Dark Tower series. I would say, for many people, King included, this is kind of his magnum opus. It's a series of 7 books, a lot of which are interconnected with other works that he's written. There were characters from other books, such as The Stand, and other stories that make appearances, or other books that he's written since starting the Dark Tower will make allusions to it, that sort of thing. And it's really fantastic. It's a very meta narrative in some ways, very fantasy, but also Wild West. It's fantastic in my opinion. Uh, did want to mention one other thing too, that he was involved in a near fatal car crash in the early 2000s, and thankfully he did survive. But apparently that sort of reinvigorated not just his writing career, but his, I guess, devotion to writing. He really, it's almost like that was kind of like his second wind, was after he was hit by a car. And I say car crash, he was not actually in a car, he was hit by a car while out walking on a road. So that might have been a little misleading there. But yeah, that's really Stephen King in a nutshell. He actually just recently, at least as the time of us recording this, just had his latest novel published roughly maybe a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. It's a novel called Fairy Tale. I have already finished it. I believe Lisa said that she's currently reading it before we started recording. So, um, yeah, I will kind of stop my little overview of Stephen King at this point, just because I don't know that there's too much more that needs to be said. And I'll say this: my first exposure to Stephen King was actually through a book fair in my middle school. I had heard of him before. I had my mom had told me about the time when she read The Shining while living alone in this like garage apartment, and that it like freaked her out so much she couldn't finish the book. And so I had him in my head as this like horror guy, and I picked up the only Stephen King book that they had, because this was a middle school book fair. It was called The Eyes of the Dragon, and I read about it, the back of it, and I was like, well, this sounds interesting. And those of you that haven't read it, it's not horror per se. It's really more of a almost pure fantasy story. There, I mean, are definitely some horror or horrific elements, but I remember reading it and going, well, this isn't that bad, but also this is really interesting. And I immediately 180'd from that into It, which I read in about 3 weeks and just devoured, and um, I've been a fan ever since. So those 2 books were kind of my gateway drug into the Stephen King universe. I'm gonna turn it over to Mel and Lisa to kind of jump in, maybe give your initial like impressions, or not even impressions, but your first encounters with Stephen King's work, or just kind of your basic overview thoughts of him, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. I will jump in and say that, of course, like everybody, my horror career or as a horror reader or lover started with Stephen King in many ways. Growing up, my father really enjoyed horror, but he did not keep the books and things like DVDs and stuff like that at our house. I think for one thing, we lived in kind of a small house growing up, so there just wasn't a whole lot of room. But he had an office, and he would keep all of his books there, and so I just never really had a reason to see what was on his office shelves. I guess when he was in between uh, patients, he would sit in his office and catch up on some reading, but he did have a copy of The Stand in at our house on our bookshelf, and I remember being really intrigued by it. The cover always really stood out to me, and I remember pulling it down several times and reading the back cover of it and trying to imagine what it was like. Because I had this idea that like I knew it was a scary book and I knew it was an adult book. So it's piqued my curiosity, but it also really intimidated me because that thing is huge. And I mean, I didn't attempt to read it until later, but I say all that because one of the fun things is I came to Stephen King probably like most people through the movies. I saw a few movies growing up, like at sleepovers at friends' houses. We would sneak them late at night, or I'd watch. I remember watching it, the first one, the Tim Curry one, and really loving it. And so as I grew older and I knew horror was something that I really enjoyed, I started reading first Stephen King short stories. And I think my first novel I read of his was Carrie. But the really fun thing was when I started really getting into horror and really kind of diving into the Stephen King world, it became this thing that my dad and I bonded over because that's when he showed me all of his collection that he had at his office. And he was like, I've had these all these years and, it's fun now to share them. So I don't know. It means a lot to me, I think, Stephen King, not just like as a horror lover and somebody who's built their career around horror, because you can't talk about the horror genre without talking about him. It's just especially modern day horror. But I think just on a personal level, to have that like relationship that I have with my dad because we've bonded over this mutual love. And I feel like from talking to people that's a lot of their stories. So I don't know. It's just kind of one of those things that like if he puts out a book or a story, I'm gonna read it. Um, no question about it. So yeah, Matt, I have Fairy Tale. I started reading it the other day. I'm really looking forward to finishing it, but um, it's so neat to see his Stephen King's fingerprints all over the horror genre over the past like 50 years and but also kind of in my personal life too. Even though I don't know the man at all, but I'm definitely a constant reader, so I enjoy it. Mel, what about you?
Well, I think I mentioned this when we were talking about Straub, when we started talking about King. It's interesting because I didn't really think of myself as a person who loved horror until later in my life. So, I mean, I was like in grad school when I started getting into more of what I had, I guess, thought was horror. I will say that when I was young, I don't remember how old I was, the original Pet Cemetery was on TV, and I happened to see a lot of it, and it creeped me out. And I mean, I remember like where I was when it happened. It's kind of like when I was really young and I saw the beginning of Jaws. Like I remember that moment. And like you were saying, Matt, you don't have to really read Stephen King to like know Stephen King. Like I think there are people who may have never read Carrie and know Carrie, if somebody mentions it, or like you said, Cujo. So yeah, it was much kind of, I guess, later in my life when I was like, oh, I'm reading more horror stuff. Of course, I was in grad school and I had like lists of stuff I wanted to get through, and I was kind of looking at the history of horror and how different aspects of it related to what I was working on. So I feel like I'm a type of person who enjoys darker fiction, but has always like tiptoed around King and never just fully dove in. Like I feel like if I had started reading him when I was younger, I probably would have had these experiences that you guys are talking about. But I kind of came into it through more, I guess, classic writers that I realized when I read Dance Macabre in my mid to late 20s had influenced King. So a lot of the older movies I'd seen, he talked about in that book. A lot of the classic writers he talked about, I was aware of or I'd started reading because I really wanted to kind of get to know the genre. So, strangely enough, even though I've read only a few books, I've probably watched more movies than I read books that were associated with King or written by King, adapted from King or written by King. That Dance Macabre kind of showed me, I think it was another indicator of how much I did like the genre because I was in the process without realizing it, kind of building that knowledge that kind of influenced him. And part of that kind of inspired me to read the books that I did read. So yeah, I feel like I have been slowly accumulating over the past like years a stack of Stephen King books I'm interested in reading. And I think this is going to inspire me to just take the plunge and pause the other stuff I'm doing and start getting more into his work so that I can, truly say that I'm not just like reading stuff that influenced him or things that he recommended to me, like seeing Peter Straub's Ghost Story and Dance Macabre, but that I am reading that originary material. So that's kind of my weird, like, I guess, slanted relationship with him, being aware of him in the popular zeitgeist and knowing him from seeing movies or parts of movies, but not really like diving into it until I really started to kind of get into the horror genre.
Well, I, for one, think that you should definitely make that plunge. it's a, it's a fun rabbit hole to go down, and I mean, if my intro kind of overview was not enough, I'll just reiterate that he is a very, very wide with his different types of stories that he writes, so that they're not all horror. Some may be horror adjacent, some may be not horror at all. So um, just throw that out there. So I know we had kind of talked about with this because again, Stephen King is kind of the elephant in the room. How do you approach this? So I know we had kind of mentioned maybe talking about some of our favorites or recommendations of his works, and I'll just say, I mean, if you have not read It or The Stand, I mean, go do that. I mean, I'm not speaking directly to you, Melanie. I'm speaking to everyone, by the way. But I know both of those are 800 to 1,000 pages, depending on font and print size and that sort of thing. So they are not short books by any means. But I mean, to get a good overview of King's style and his depth, I think either one of those is probably a really good place to start. I think one of the things that I like the most about Stephen King are his characters. They are almost always, they feel like real people. They feel like fleshed out characters. Very rarely do you get one that's one dimensional. Even the villains that are sometimes meant to be this kind of like, wahahaha villain, they still have subtleties to them that make them more interesting and more than one dimensional villains. um, I actually fairly recently read Needful Things for the first time. I say recently, it was probably about a year ago now, but um, I mean, that was one where the villain was very much, I think, in many other people's hands, could have been just a very flat character, but he was not in the way Stephen King portrayed him. And to really get a good sense of that, I would say the longer books are, of course, the ones where the characters are the most developed. I'll say this: the first time I read it, which was probably way too young, but I mean, I was at the end. I was sad that the book was over because I had grown to like the characters so much that I wanted it to keep going. And I mean, I think that's the hallmark of an excellent book, is that you just want it to keep going and never end. So I know, Melanie, you may not be able to make recommendations, but Lisa, do you have a couple to throw out there that, like, kind of the big ones that stand out for you?
Yeah, so it is an excellent recommendation. That book, Matt, as you know, is one of the more terrifying books that I've ever read. um, in fact, I think the first time I read it, I was in bed with like a cold or the flu or something like that. But it was a sickness that, I felt bad enough that I had to like lay in bed and I had nothing else to do. And so I picked up the book and I was like, well, I might as well read this. And I just remember being terrified. Like every shadow in the room scared me. um so that I think is a really really good one. And The Stand, of course, I think a lot of people would agree that it's one of his best. Um I'm gonna throw out a few different ones. I also, by the way, like Needful Things. That one is really excellent. If you're looking for good horror, like something that is gonna scare you or make you feel those kind of like horror emotions, the thrills, if you will. But you're looking for something shorter, like if it is does not it is a bit intimidating, which I completely understand. Misery is a really good read, and that's a really quick read. Um, and I mean, most people know it from the movie. The movie adaptation is great too, but the book itself is really really good. It's short, it's quick, and I think, Matt, to your point, it's only got two characters. So even though he doesn't devote like 1,000 pages to character development, you still get really developed characters. And that's a fun read. There's another one that um I hear more people recently talk about it, but it's one of his older ones and it's called The Long Walk, which is, I guess, kind of speculative fiction. Maybe you might couch it as that. It's definitely in the horror zone. It's terrifying. Um, I think it was one of the Richard Bachman books originally, but don't hold me to that because I didn't look that up. But The Long Walk is really good. It is one of those books that you can read it really quickly. Like you can burn through the pages, and it is a panic attack in a book. That's the best way I can describe it. Like it is so terrifying. So that's a really great one. Um and then I guess I just want to throw out, well, and The Shining too. That of course is another classic, but for those readers, maybe Mel especially, if you're looking for something that's not maybe quite as scary, like if you want to build up to that, or if like you're not the biggest horror fan, but you want to try some Stephen King because you've enjoyed some of the movies, he's got some other ones that like have horror elements to it, but that I think the non-horror fan would enjoy. And so that includes Lisey's Story, which is a really great book. Under the Dome, which I don't know, I really liked the book. We won't talk about the TV adaptation, but I really did enjoy reading the book. And then 11/22/63, which is, it's time travel. It's like historical fantasy, I guess is the way you would describe it. But I think those are really good ways into Stephen King if you're not like a really hardcore horror fan and you don't want something that's gonna like give you a panic attack when you read it because like I said, it is terrifying. um the Long Walk, I wish I had like my Apple Watch on when I need to read it and put my Apple Watch on because I feel like my um I feel like my heartbeat would go up while I was reading that. Is that kind of book. It's very, very suspenseful. So I don't know. Those are a few of my recommendations.
Yeah, I actually have Lizzy's story that you told me about it like a year or so ago, and I went out and bought it, and I just haven't gotten to it yet. But I have that book disease that readers have, where you buy a bunch of books and you just stack them up and don't quite get to them, basically. So yes, I am definitely going to have to get into that one soon. And The Shining, I love The Shining. I read The Shining when when I knew that he was inspired by Shirley Jackson's work, and I like the movie too. So you got that one, Lisa, but that is a favorite of mine. And then earlier this year, I'm only going to talk about a couple, but earlier this year I picked up Joyland, because it's a mystery slash ghost story, and I enjoyed it. It was kind of a period piece. The haunting was interesting to me, and the fact that there was a mystery aspect to it too, because I am a mystery fan. So yeah, I like this idea of him just branching out from horror into more dramatic things or mysteries or thrillers or fantasy. I mean, I guess in that vein, if we're going to talk about stuff that's not necessarily horror qua horror, maybe like something like The Body. It was also a shorter one as well.
Well, and to circle back to what you were saying, Lisa, I'll also recommend Under the Dome and 11/22/63. Both of those were some of the standouts of his kind of later period. I've got it pulled up here. Under the Dome came out in 2009, and 11/22/63 was 2 years later in 2011. And there was actually a Hulu miniseries of 11/22/63 that did a really good job of adapting that one. It does have James Franco, who I'm not a huge fan of in the main role, but I liked the adaptation. I thought they did a really good job with it. And this isn't a spoiler for that story at all, but the date, of course, is the date of JFK's assassination, and one of the main things is that the main character is trying to prevent that because he discovers a way, not a way of time travel, but a door in the back of a diner that leads to one specific date in, like, I think it's like 1957 or something like that, or maybe it's even earlier. And that's the part that I love about this, is that in order to try to prevent the JFK assassination, he has to live in the past for like 6 years or something like that. So he's like, his time travel is not really time travel. I think you hit the nail on the head with almost calling it historical fiction. And I just really liked that premise, that it's not some guy with a time machine going back to prevent the Kennedy assassination. It's a guy who finds a door to a day in the 1950s and decides to stay back then and live through several years worth of time in order to try to stop the assassination. So it's a pretty good one.
Oh, Matt, I have a question for you. So, we've been talking about doing this episode for, a bit now, like right before season 7 started. So I actually like ran my finger down my stack of books I've been collecting, and I started reading Firestarter like a week or so ago. I'm really enjoying it so far. Have I chosen wisely as a book to add to my repertoire?
No, you've chosen poorly.
No.
I'm joking. I have both read Firestarter and seen the movie adaptation of it, the original one, the one with Drew Barrymore and George C. Scott. But it has been so very long since then that I don't remember a whole lot about it. I really liked it when I was younger. I do remember that much, and I remember the basic overview of the kind of plot of it. But yeah, I think you. I think it's a good one. I don't know if it's one I'd recommend as like a starter book for Stephen King, but it's a good book. So I mean, I don't think you've chosen poorly at all in in this regard.
I guess my starter book with him was The Shining, so I guess I picked pretty well for that.
Yeah, that's a pretty good intro there.
Because that was my first one.
Well, and like I said, I still remember it's been 25 years probably since my mom told me this story, but yet she told me that when The Shining came out, she was living alone in like a little one bedroom garage apartment and was reading it while home alone, and it freaked her out so much that she had to stop reading it. I think she did finish the book if I remember correctly, but like she was in the middle of reading it and like she could hear the like the stairs creaking outside because it was, a second floor garage apartment kind of thing from like the wind. And she's like, nope, I got to stop reading this right now. This is freaking me out too much. So,
Yeah, I don't remember how many years it's been since I read it, but when I did, it was a daytime reading book. It was
yes,
not something I read before I went to bed.
It's definitely not a before bedtime book. That's for sure.
I have to say, like some of the beginning scenes in Firestarter are reminding me of some of the things that I saw happening in Talisman, which of course I went ahead and was reading for the Peter Straub episode. So it's kind of interesting to see these little touches. I think I even said when we talked about Talisman that the theme park reminded me of the theme park in Joyland. So that I'm already, even though I haven't read as many of his books as you guys have, I'm already seeing these like kind of touchstone points of the child main character, the pursuit and travel across America in some respects, and the nostalgia aspects. So yeah, I think I just need to really like just pull off the band-aid and take the plunge and read more.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we should also, mention, I mean, Mel, you mentioned The Body, which is, I guess it's technically a novella of his, but a lot of his short fiction is great. The Body comes from one of my favorite collections of his, Different Seasons, which is 4 novellas. So it has Apt Pupil, which of course was made into the movie Apt Pupil, The Body, which of course was made into the movie Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, again adapted. And then the other one that was not, that as far as I know has never been adapted, is The Breathing Method. I don't think it's like as stand out as the rest of the stories in that collection, but I do want to mention it, Mel, because as you were talking about like the crossovers between King's work and Straub's work, the breathing method really struck me as something that reminded me of Straub, in particular, his ghost story, because in that one there's like this frame story where a guy is telling a story which ends up being the breathing method story, but it's where he has this kind of like men's club where all these people get together and tell each other strange stories around like a fire. It's set in the winter. I think the story itself is set right before Christmas or right at Christmas time, so it's kind of a Christmas ghost story, but in like a really horrific way because King wrote it. So like I said, I don't think it's the most interesting one that's in there, but it's worth a mention, especially since we've been talking about Straub. And Stephen King wrote one of my favorite short stories of all times, which was The Jaunt, which came out in the early 80s and was eventually collected into Skeleton Crew, which is another really great collection. But The Jaunt is just, I will find myself randomly thinking of that story just as I'm like doing something during my day. Um, it's a really unique story. I haven't read anything like it. It's strange and um, really horrific. Like I won't spoil anything if our listeners have not read The Jaunt, but it's the the things that happen in the story, or the thing that happens in the story, is really just it's terrifying. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to throw that one out there too, because he's got a lot of really good short stories for people who might want to start that way.
Yeah, Lisa, I remember, this was a few years ago. We were doing alternate universe and portal horror fiction or whatever. You told me about his story, The Cookie Jar, and I read it and I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I still kind of remember it. It kind of got in my brain, I guess. So yeah, I probably ought to read some more short stories too. I'm taking notes.
Well, before we wrap up kind of our discussion, I already have a feeling we're going to have to come back at some point for like a part 2 on Stephen King's writing, because it's just impossible to talk about all of the things that we love. But I do want to give kind of a shout out to some things that weren't mentioned. One of those is the Dark Tower series, which I know I've enjoyed. Matt, I think we've talked about it in the past, just kind of off the podcast. So, that's also something that I think, if people want something to read that's not maybe straight up horror, would probably enjoy that series. And then his nonfiction is really great. In particular, the ones that I have read most often, Dance Macabre, which came out in 1981, but I think he has updated it since then. And that is like his nonfiction look at the horror genre, and just his musings on it is really, really great. And then his book on writing, a memoir of the craft. So he gives some really useful information for writers out there, but also just kind of talks about his own personal relationship with writing. So it ends up kind of being an autobiography in some places, but then also like just a really good look at the craft itself. And so I know for a lot of people, myself included, it's kind of a writing Bible that people will read over and over again. That came out in 2000. And I'm not sure if that's been updated since then, but I'm sure it has. I just don't know. But anyway, it's those are really great ones too. If you're looking for something that maybe isn't fiction, but is still a really interesting read. Well, I guess that's it for today. It seems kind of crazy that we tried to cram so much Stephen King into one episode, but I guess that's where we're at right now. We will return to it in the future. In the meantime, we're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. We have 6 seasons worth of mini episodes for you to go back and check out. Really great kind of backlog of just a lot of content, if that's something that sounds interesting to you. If you can't do that, we completely understand. But what you could do, and what we ask you to do, is to simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help us immensely because it helps other listeners find us. The music is by Nicholas Gasparini. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.